Hello friends, welcome again. Friends, some of my subscribers from Gujarat University have demanded that I should upload videos on the restoration period, on the period of Alexander Pope. So friends, one video on restoration age I already uploaded some 2 days back, and today I am here before you to discuss English literature during the age of Alexander Pope. Friends, this beginning of 18th century is known as the age of Alexander Pope. It is also known as the Neo-classical period. It is known as the Augustan Age. It is known as the age of satire. It is also known as the age of reason. Friends, in this video, we are going to discuss different literary characteristics of this particular period in the beginning of 18th century. But first, we must begin with the question, why is this period, the beginning of 18th century, why is it called the age of Pope, the age of Alexander Pope? Then to answer this, let me tell you that the early part of the 18th century, the first half of 18th century is known as the Augustan Age in English literature. It is also known as the age of Pope. Why? Because Pope was the most dominant literary personality during this period. Though there were some number of other important writers like Richard Still, Joseph Addison, Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe, and all others, but still, Pope was the only writer who devoted himself completely to English literature. In fact, Alexander Pope was the most representative poet of this time, and his poetry served as a model for other poets who followed him later. And so, in short, you can say that this age is known as the age of Pope. Why? Because, to use the words of John Dryden said that in every age there is one genius who becomes the mouthpiece of his age. And it is true about Alexander Pope that he was the true mouthpiece, true representative poet of the 18th century. And that is why, the first half of the 18th century is known as the age of Pope. But first, if you want to understand the literary characteristics of the age of Pope, first let us have a look at what happened before the age of Pope. You know that before Alexander Pope, the most important period was the period of restoration, period from 1660 to 1700. Okay, during the rule of King Charles II, that means during the restoration period, people witnessed many intrigues, plots, love affairs, and moral degeneration in the life of aristocratic people. The upper class people, their life was morally degenerated. In the field of politics, in the field of religion, there so many plots and intrigues were going on. People became obsessed with the coarse and immoral life of the society, and that is the reason why the beginning of the 18th century saw some attempts in the direction of moral regeneration. Change is the essence of life. During the Restoration period, if immorality was reached its peak, but in the 18th century there was a change, and that change was that there were some attempts by some writers to bring about the regeneration in the field of moralism. Let's now come back to the discussion of the age of Alexander Pope. The 18th century in English literature is known as the Augustan Age also. It is also known as the Neo-classical age or the age of reason, the age of satire also. The term Augustan Age actually comes from the imitation of the original Augustan writers, like Virgil and Horace, by many of the writers of this period. The point is that during the first half of 18th century, many writers they followed the style of Virgil, of Horace, and Virgil and Horace are known as Augustan writers, ancient classical writers, and that's why, because they followed those Augustan writers, that's why this period, the first half of the 18th century, is known as the Augustan Age. Okay, this Augustan Age was the period after the Restoration era to the death of Alexander Pope. So, to be precise, if I want to give you the exact dates, then you can say that this age of Pope or the Augustan Age begins from 1690 and ends in 1744. The major writers of this age were Alexander Pope himself, John Dryden in the field of poetry, Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Richard Still in the field of prose. Okay, these were the major writers of the age. Matthew Arnold, who lived during the 19th century, he was an important critic of English literature. He called this period as our admirable and indispensable 18th century. So Matthew Arnold admired this period as indispensable 18th century. This age saw the rise of the periodical essays and the rise of the novels. Okay, so that means 18th century was the age of prose literature. Why prose literature? Because only two forms of literature became so much popular during the 18th century, and these two forms of literature are periodical essays in the hands of Richard Steele and Joseph Addison, and novels in the hands of Samuel Richardson. Just like as during the Restoration Age, in this age also, in this Augustan Age also, the French influence was very dominant, and literature was dominated by classicism. Now friends, let's discuss the social and literary characteristics of this age. If I want to begin with the social characteristics, then you have to consider the religious and political debates which were going on in the 18th century. The 18th century was in reality an age of tensions. Okay, it was a tension between the rural life and the urban life, the rural people and the urban people. There were some tensions also between the Puritans and the Protestants. There were some tensions between the two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. Okay, the society was divided into two divisions. Either they favored the Whigs, one political party, or they favored the Tories, the another important political party. So, there were so many tensions and quarrels and debates and controversies going on both in the field of religion and politics. Okay, Addison, in fact, is an important prose writer, an important essayist of the 18th century who brought about a kind, he tried to humanize this tension, humanize his age, and he tried to calm down the political tensions of his age by writing, by publishing his periodical essays in the Spectator and also in the Tatler. The Spectator and the Tatler, these were the two magazines in which Richard Steele and Joseph Addison, they published their literary essays. Both the parties, the Whigs and the Tories, they tried to secure the help of the men of literary ability, and the authors now acquired an importance and an influence which they had never enjoyed before. So these writers like Addison and Steele and others, they were writing about politics in their essays. Okay, so these political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, for them these literary personalities were very important. In fact, E. Albert, an important historian of English literature, he has rightly said that it was the golden age of political pamphleteering and the writers made the most of it. E. Albert wants to say that this age was the golden age for political pamphlets. Pamphlets means short essays, right? So political essays were written during this period. The Puritans, who looked down upon the upper class as immoral, and on the other hand, the courtiers, they called the Puritans as hypocrites. This tension between the Puritans and the courtiers, the Puritans and the courtiers who were ruling party, this conflict is also very easily found in the literature which was published during the 18th century. Another important feature of this period is the rise and popularity of coffee houses. Coffee houses became the center of the fashionable and public life. These coffee houses and clubs, they were entirely dominated by the political parties. जैसे आज के समय में हमारे समाज में जैसे चाय पे चर्चा होती है, चाय पे लोग क्या क्या चर्चा करते हैं, we discuss politics, right? We discuss current affairs. In the same manner, in those times also, these coffee houses became popular and literature emerged from these coffee houses. People gathered there to show their wit, their intelligence, their discussions, and they discussed the news of the day and forecast the fall of one and the rise of the another. Sometimes they forecasted that the Whigs will go away and the Tories will start ruling. So they were discussing about the rise and fall of the political parties in their nation, and this encouraged the rise of periodical essays which presented this talk of the town, which presented all these minute things which were discussed in the coffee houses in the realistic manner in the newspapers and magazines. There were many vices, okay? खराब चीज़ें समाज में अस्तित्व पाई जाती थी, और these two vices were drinking, the habit of drinking and the habit of gambling among the people. Popularity, because of the popularity of the clubs and coffee houses, these things gave birth to the vices of drinking and gambling. Even you will be surprised to know that the Secretary of the State of England, Horace Walpole, was himself found drunk all the times. And not only this, Bolingbroke is also said to have been given the title Four Bottle Man. So he was also fond of drinking. He was also a drunkard. Not only this, Alexander Pope himself, who was the representative literary personality of this age, he was denied. He was asked by the doctors not to drink, but still he also was habituated of drinking, and he invited his death by drinking. This is what is believed among the scholars. Gambling was also popular among the people, and not only this, women were also playing these cards and all. So gambling and drinking, they are also found in the society, and they are very much reflected in the literature of this time. Over and above, immorality was an important feature of this English society. The beginning of the 18th century, it witnessed the immorality in all walks of life. Immorality in domestic life and corruption in the courts, all these things are reflected in the literature of this period. Victor Hugo, he has satirized the immorality of women when he writes, I quote, he writes that the wife bolts means blows, okay, the wife bolts out her husband, she shuts herself in Eden with Satan, and Adam is left out. This shows that the wives of this time, they were not faithful to their husbands, and they were playing games of love with other men of the time. Okay, if I talk about literary characteristics of this age, then you have to remember that this age is known as the age of prose and reason. Why? Because there was a rise of periodical essays and there was a rise of novel during the 18th century. A large number of practical interests arising from the new social and political conditions made the pamphlets, the magazines and the newspapers very popular. And the magazines, pamphlets and newspapers were written in prose form, not in poetic form. And that's why there was a decline of poetry during the 18th century. Poetry was not an adequate form for the expression of the life of the people, and that's why prose developed rapidly and excellently during this age. In fact, poetry itself became prosaic. Even if you read the here and there poetry which was written, that poetry was also having prosaic nature, right? It was looking like prose. So nothing poetic was found in the poetry published during the 18th century. Okay, so imaginations, emotions, all these things have disappeared from poetry during the age of Alexander Pope. Okay, satire, intelligence, all these things were at the core of the literature produced during this time. Satire, most writers of the first half of the 18th century used satire as an important medium, as an important weapon to expose the vanity, the hypocrisy of the aristocratic people. They wrought for the political parties and they were rewarded by these political parties like the Whigs and the Tories. Why? Because they satirized their enemies in their essays, periodical essays, and this is how advanced their special political interests. So, for politicians also, this Joseph Addison, Richard Steele and other periodical essays, they were very important. Why? Because they were criticizing, they were satirizing their enemies in their literature. Pope was an exception. Okay, he did not write much about politics, but he too was a satirist, a great satirist. There were some other writers like Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, Daniel Defoe. They were also the outstanding satirists of this age. Friends, this Augustan age or the age of Pope is also known as the age of classicism, the age of Neo-classicism. The writers of this period, they completely disregarded the Elizabethan trends of writing literature. They did not follow the Elizabethan Romanticism. The age of 18th century produced the literature which was based on realism. So realism was in opposition to romanticism. Okay, these writers, mainly the writers of the 18th century, mainly were influenced by the French writers, especially Boileau, who insisted on precise rules of writing poetry. Why is it called classical, the age of Neo-classicism? It is called the age of Neo-classicism because these writers of the 18th century, they followed the French writers, and for the French writers, to adhere to the rules and regulations was very important. So by when they are following the norms, the rules and regulations as given by the ancient writers, they became classical writers. I hope you understand. When you are following the ancient writers, when you are following on strict rules, while writing literature, your literature becomes classical literature. Alexander Pope and Dr. Samuel Johnson, they pioneered, the revival of classicism, which confirmed to rules established by the great writers of other nations, not England. They followed French writers. Okay, they mainly also followed the norms of Aristotle, the ancient critique. They followed the norms of Horace, the Roman ancient poet, and that's why this literature is known as neoclassical literature. These writers, they preferred only set rules to the depth and seriousness of subject matter. Okay, another important thing that you find in the literature of the 18th century is the town life. Town life was the main subject matter of the literature of the 18th century. Okay, clubs and coffee houses and the manners of the people of the town, they became the center of focus for the writers of the 18th century. Not only this, they focused also on the middle class people, their hopes and their dreams, their aspirations, their personal domestic problems. All these problems of the middle class people, they were given much expression in the works of Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson, Richard Steele, Joseph Addison and all others. Right? Heroic couplet was the most befitting medium to express realism in satirical tone. So they used heroic couplet in their poetry. In fact, heroic couplet was recognized as the only medium for poetic expression. Whatever little poetry was written during the 18th century, that was written in heroic couplet. If you read the poetry of Alexander Pope, he has adopted this style of writing poetry in heroic couplet. The language of poetry during this period was full of pomp and the language was not easy to understand. Okay, the common words or the ordinary language were intentionally kept out from the poetic literature of the 18th century. The result was that the literature of this Augustan age became, the poetry of the Augustan age became very artificial, rational and intellectual poetry. It appeals our mind rather than our heart. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion on the literary characteristics of this Augustan age or the age of Pope. But before I leave, let me conclude the whole discussion by saying that the 18th century is considered as the age of prose. Why? Because there was a development of periodical essays, there was a development of novels. It is also known as the age of satire, as the age of Neo-classicism. Urban life, okay, rather than rural life, was the focus of the writers. Middle class people were presented for the first time in literature, and there was a decline in the field of drama and poetry during the 18th century. So friends, here we end up this discussion. I hope you like this video. If you really like the video, please share this video among your all friends and classmates and subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.